talk is again turning to the final deciders, the members of the Electoral College. After Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College vote to Donald Trump, there were new calls to abolish the constitutionally mandated system.
Before the founding, most people believed that democracies could only be executed at a very small scale, that is to say, a city-state. But our founders had a different notion. They thought not only could you have a republic, a representative form of government in this large nation, but in fact that republic would be better. And the reason it would be better was because if you enlarge the scope of the people within a government, those people have to form coalitions.
One of the things that probably they didn't even fully anticipate was that the Electoral College would force you as a presidential candidate to have to put together a national coalition. You couldn't do it winning one popular state or a sectional candidate or a special interest candidate. You had to bring together diverse groups. You may be unified by a certain principle, but on other issues you may not be so much together on. Culturally, you may not like each other. But it was a system that allowed for political competition, but doing so in a way in which you tried to bring people together rather than trying to find ways of dividing and inflaming passions.
So what the Electoral College does, it forces everyone to make sure that they make the rounds, not just to middle America, not just to the financiers of the world in New York, not just Tinseltown in California, to make sure that they make the rounds going to all the states, all of America, to bring their unified message.
The presidential vote is not one big thing. It's broken into pieces. And how you put those pieces together like a puzzle is how the president creates a governing consensus.
The Democrats are a going concern in the most Republican states, in Oklahoma, in Wyoming. The Republicans have campaign offices in political organizations in California, in Vermont. This is part of the Electoral College, driving the parties to constantly be probing, can we pull this state or that state into our coalition? We hear this talk every 4 years about expanding the map. That's Electoral College lingo, right? Expanding the map means reaching out, winning people over, building a bigger coalition. Expanding the map is an inherently good thing that comes directly from the Electoral College.
Without the Electoral College, the presidency would be decided in Boston, New York, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. That's where the game would be without the Electoral College. Instead of that, you have candidates for president going all over the country and not just going to urban cores.
Politics are local. So the Electoral College brings a national campaign to the local community.
Candidates have to be careful about how they allocate their time and resources because it is unproductive to spend too much time in one part of the country or in one big city. So over and over again throughout history, presidential candidates who have tried to overly focus on one type of voter have failed. The Electoral College does not reward that. On the flip side, if we had a national popular vote system, we would suddenly find that strategy became very productive because it's easier to go spend a bunch of time racking up votes among voters that already want to vote for you. You can imagine a Democrat running out to Los Angeles or San Francisco and promising the environmental lobby anything they want, because if you can get 100% of California voters behind you, that's way better than getting 50.01% of voters behind you. Likewise, you can see Republicans running out to Houston and Dallas and promising the oil interests anything they want.
You're now just chasing a few ideas and policies in the most populated areas. Obviously, in a system without the Electoral College, you're now going to start promising positions of power in the bureaucracy in D.C. to whatever locations get that president the national popular vote majority that he needs.
Another way that the Electoral College works in the direction of conferring legitimacy is the way that it sustains the two-party system. We have had a two-party system since the 1790s. People in the Constitutional Convention hadn't envisioned a party system, but the party system did come into existence. One major reason that it comes into existence is the Electoral College. Now, sometimes we have had third-party candidates. There have been occasions which we have even had a fourth-party candidate, maybe even a fifth. They tend to be very narrow, single-issue kinds of events, and they're often quite ephemeral because they're built around personalities.
The assumption, I think, is once you eliminate the Electoral College, that we will continue to have two parties. And so that will mean that everyone who's the nominee of one of the major parties will come very close to getting a majority. If not a majority, at least very close to a majority. But that's not true, because once you eliminate the usefulness of the Electoral College, if you go to a system where it's just the popular vote, you could have 12, 15, 20 parties.
To get the majority in the Electoral College, you need to concentrate people's votes behind a limited number of candidates. You can't really elect a candidate president who only brings in about 15 or 20% of the popular vote in the states.
If you have a direct popular vote in which the person who just gets the most votes wins, and doesn't have to have a majority, just more than anybody else, this will encourage candidates to stay in the race as long as they think there's any chance they can be the one with the most votes. If you're in a multi-candidate, a direct popular vote, and you're running third with, say, 24%, and the person in second has 28, and the person first has 30, maybe you can catch them. Everybody stays in the race, and you end up actually not getting a clear popular winner.
Because once you eliminate the usefulness of the Electoral College, what happens is that everyone will get into the game. We will have a lot of people running for the pro-immigration party and the anti-immigration party and the pro-choice and the pro-life parties. In fact, it'd be entirely possible that no one would even come close when the outcome comes. And let's assume that in the end, a person who is in the pro-life parties gets 23% of the vote, and that happens to be the highest percentage of anyone running. Well, then the voters in New York and California and Illinois and Wisconsin who voted for someone else entirely would find that they've elected a president who is pro-life.
We would elect a president on the basis of someone who comes in with 25% of the vote over the candidates who came in with 24% and 23%? Don't you think the people that got the 24 and the 23 would make a great deal of grief about a margin that narrow? Don't you think that would cut into the legitimacy of the candidate with 25%? Of course it would. It would destabilize the entire process of governing. The two-party systems actually helps to bind the nation together, because if you have Democrats in Maine and Democrats in Minnesota and Democrats in Oregon, they're still all Democrats, and they communicate with each other, and they support a common set of candidates. Republicans in Florida, Republicans in Oklahoma, Republicans in Michigan may all be in those different states, but they're all lined up behind a common platform and common candidates. And what this does, it tamps down divisions within the nation and makes us realize that although we may be from Michigan or Oklahoma or Oregon, fundamentally, when we act politically, we're acting as Americans. And that's an important glue for our national unity.
With the Electoral College system, if you want to get elected, you want to attract a broad spectrum of the American people. So that keeps people who have very extreme views out of the presidential race. If you can win the presidential race with just 25% of the vote, then the kind of extremist candidates that we don't want to have running the country might be able to win the presidential election.
Without the Electoral College, there's no longer any motivation to compromise. The attitude becomes, my 18% beat your 17%, so I really don't care what you think. And what you see in those situations is extremists tend to be rewarded because they no longer have to tone down, they no longer have to work with others. And so extreme positions can have a lot more influence on the process.
We have
Here's what people seem to not understand. The world that will exist in a post-electoral college America are 5 billionaires and a bunch of multimillionaires running for president, trying to be as extreme as necessary without alienating enough people so that they can get a small sliver of the tranche of voters necessary to get elected president of the United States.
That's where one candidate who can significantly outspend the other candidates could really make a difference in being able to win an election, particularly because these days, a very large percentage of the American people live in a very small number of media markets. And that is where having a lot of money, being able to buy media in the big, dense, urban cities could really make the difference in changing the results of a presidential election.
Tonight, we say to Michael Bloomberg and other billionaires, sorry, you ain't gonna buy this election.
And what the Electoral College does is the last fortress, if you will, to hold back individuals that think that they can come in and buy our republic, buy our vote.
So the billionaires of the world certainly have the resources individually to run that can make it much easier for a candidate to create the staff and the advertising revenue that would allow them to have greater success on a national popular vote scale than they do on the national scale we have now, where you have to appeal to different state constituencies.
Michael Bloomberg says he is ready to run, but he plans to skip the first 4 2020 Democratic contests. That's a risky strategy.
If you really analyze somebody like Mike Bloomberg, who's a billionaire, man, it's $55 billion. He can spend $5 billion and not blink. But he can't buy the election because he has to be able to win the primary, because that's the only way he's going to have a viable chance. And the reason that's the only way he's going to have a viable chance is because, wait for it, the Electoral College. Right? So when you have a scenario where you have removed the Electoral College, now he no longer has to even engage in the primary process. He can simply go directly to the general election and talk about, how do I get the most amount of votes that get me to the place where I need to be? It's not about a majority. It's about finding a way to game the system in a way that allows his voice and his money to speak the loudest.
You would have to figure out, how are we going to run that election? And I think that means you would have to have a single national standard by which everybody votes. Now that may sound fairly attractive. Why not? Until again you consider that this is a very large, enormous country with great geographic differences between different states, different demographics and so on. What makes sense for one state doesn't make sense for every other.
And then you would have to have much more control by the federal government. Control by the federal government, eliminating the involvement of the states. Now you would have accomplished exactly what the framers tried to avoid. You would put control in one place. And how are you going to stop the corruption there? Whichever party it is.
Without the Electoral College, the federal government would have to take more control over elections, which means that presidential appointees would wind up running presidential elections, right? Barack Obama's people would have been in charge of Barack Obama's re-election. Donald Trump's people would be in charge of Donald Trump's re-election, right? The Electoral College pushes that power out of Washington, D.C., down into the states. States run elections. States are in charge. It's distributed. No one state controls the outcome. Instead, it's up to 51 different jurisdictions to run that election.
There's a mechanism for what happens if it's too close to call in a particular state, not if it's too close to call across the country. This would create, quite simply, chaos. And it would throw any election like that, and I think that it would be far more common that you would have these sorts of elections, to the courts.
Sometimes we hear a serious objection to the Electoral College, lodged on the grounds that the Electoral College was designed by the Constitutional Convention to protect slavery. And the reasoning runs like this. The Electoral College is composed of representatives from every state based on your number of members in the House of Representatives and your number of senators. Well, isn't that a revelation? Because in that case, that means that for the purpose of representation, southern states could count their slaves who otherwise were not permitted any voice in the political process, towards their representatives, and those representatives would therefore pile up in the Electoral College, and there would be an artificial bonus given to slaveholding states to cast votes in favor of pro-slavery policies. And thus, the Electoral College, designed to operate by the Constitutional Convention for the interests of slavery. And a great aha moment erupts at that point. The difficulty is that it is an aha moment with no air in the balloon. In 1787, all of the states, not just the southern states, excepting alone Massachusetts, legalized slavery. There was no bonus paid by the Electoral College to slave-owning states versus free states. All the states enjoyed that bonus. The largest slaveholding state in the Union in 1787 was Virginia. The largest northern slaveholding state, New York.
The 3/5 compromise is not created for the Electoral College. It is created for the House of Representatives. The founders need to figure out, how do you represent the people and the states? Well, already built into the system is the representation for the House, the representation for the Senate. All they do is say, that math has already been vetted. It has already been through the compromise. The North is agreeing with it. The South agrees with the West, and the East agree with it. We agree with that. That is the great compromise. We will build that into the presidency.
When the Electoral College is finally determined upon as a mechanism for electing the president, the question of slavery never entered into the consideration because it wouldn't have had any application. There was no Electoral College advantage for slaveholding states because in 1787 they were all slaveholding states. 25 years later, that's going to change as northern states one by one move into the non-slaveholding column. But the members of the Constitutional Convention weren't writing the Constitution with a view towards saying, aha, 25 years from now, we know that there will be a bonus for slaveholding states in the Electoral College. Well, yes, there was, but it was a temporary one. It was already ebbing away by the time Abraham Lincoln is elected.
Proponents of that argument have decided that if they tarnish the institution of the Electoral College with racism, then that automatically means it is suspect and needs to be replaced. But it's just ahistorical, it's not accurate, and it's not really honest, frankly.